Chapter 1. The Invitation. They said it was a school, but no one could tell him what they studied. Thomas Blackwood had asked 3 times at the orphanage. First Mrs. Hartwell, then the visiting clergyman, then even old Mr. Grimsby, who swept the halls and usually knew everything worth knowing. Each time their faces went peculiarly blank, as if someone had wiped chalk from a board. Education, Mrs. Hartwell had said finally, her usual sharpness dulled to something soft and distant. A proper education for boys like you. Boys like him. Powerless boys. Forgotten boys. The kind who disappeared into the northern moors and were never spoken of again. The invitation had arrived on a Tuesday, stitched, actually unstitched, onto parchment that felt wrong beneath his fingers. The thread was too fine, too dark, catching the light in ways that made his stomach turn. When he held it up to the window, he could see the tiny puncture holes where a needle had drawn something that looked suspiciously like hair through the paper. Master Thomas Blackwood, it read in spidery script, "And you are cordially invited to attend Ealdor Hollow Academy for the advancement of neglected arts. Term begins immediately. No belongings necessary. Transportation will be provided. Signed." And the headmaster, there was no seal, no address, no indication of how the letter had found its way into a small trunk. Mrs. Hartwell insisted it had been delivered properly, though the postman swore he'd brought nothing to Greystone Orphanage that day. Now, 3 hours into a carriage ride across increasingly desolate moorland, Thomas began to understand why no one could describe what the school taught. The driver hadn't spoken a single word since collecting him, hadn't even acknowledged Thomas's attempts at conversation. The man sat hunched on his seat like a question mark, his face hidden beneath a broad hat that seemed to cast shadows even in the gray afternoon light. The moors stretched endlessly in all directions, punctuated only by standing stones that grew more frequent as they traveled deeper into the wasteland. Some stood alone, others in circles, all of them carved with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Thomas found himself counting them, 7, 12, 18, before forcing himself to look away. Something about the stones made his teeth ache. How much further? He tried again. The driver's shoulders shifted slightly, which might have been a shrug or might have been the wind. As the afternoon wore on, the landscape began to change in subtle ways that made Thomas's skin crawl. The grass grew in unnatural patterns, spirals and geometric shapes that surely couldn't be coincidental. The few trees they passed were leafless despite the season, their branches twisted into configurations that looked almost like letters in an alphabet he didn't recognize. And then, just as the light was beginning to fail, Ealdor Hollow came into view. Thomas's first thought was that they'd made a mistake. The building rising from a hollow between 2 hills looked nothing like a school. It looked like something that had been buried and recently excavated. The architecture was wrong, all acute angles and impossible proportions that made his eyes water when he tried to follow the lines of the walls to their logical conclusions. The carriage stopped at a gate that stood open despite having no visible hinges. Beyond it, a path of white stones led to the main entrance, a massive door of black wood bound with iron that had gone green with age. "This is it?" Thomas asked, but the driver was already climbing down to retrieve Thomas's single bag from the back of the carriage. The man set the bag on the ground and climbed back to his seat without a word. A moment later, the carriage was rolling away, disappearing into the gathering dusk as if it had never been there at all. Thomas stood alone before the gate, his bag at his feet, and tried to summon the courage to walk up that path of white stones. The building seemed to shift slightly when he wasn't looking directly at it, as if it were breathing. Windows stared down at him like dark eyes, though he could swear he'd counted a different number of them just moments before. No belongings necessary, the invitation had said. He almost left his bag there on the ground, but some instinct made him pick it up again. He had so little. He wasn't about to abandon what remained. The white stones were smooth beneath his feet, worn to perfect ovals by countless footsteps, or perhaps they'd been carved that way. As he walked, Thomas noticed that each stone bore a small mark, a tiny symbol scratched into the surface. The marks were different on each stone, but somehow they formed a pattern, a sequence that his eyes could follow even if his mind couldn't understand it. The great door swung open before he could knock. Beyond the threshold lay an entrance hall that defied the building's exterior proportions, the ceiling arched impossibly high, disappearing into shadows that seemed to move with their own purpose. Portraits lined the walls, dozens of them, all showing young men about Thomas's age. Their eyes followed him as he stepped inside, though their faces remained perfectly still. "Welcome to Ealdor Hollow." Thomas spun around, but saw no one. The voice had come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the stone walls with a quality that made it impossible to determine its source. "Classes begin at dawn," the voice continued. "Your dormitory is up the main stair, third door on the left. You will find everything you need." "Wait!" Thomas called out, his own voice sounding thin and small in the vast space. "I have questions." But there was no response. The silence that settled over the hall was complete, heavy as wool and twice as smothering. Thomas climbed the main stair, his footsteps echoing despite his efforts to move quietly. The banister was carved from some dark wood that felt uncomfortably warm beneath his palm, as if it retained the heat of every hand that had ever touched it. The third door on the left stood slightly ajar. Beyond it lay a small room containing a narrow bed, a desk, and a wardrobe. On the bed was a uniform, black trousers, white shirt, and a jacket of deep blue wool. The jacket bore no crest or insignia, only a small symbol embroidered in silver thread over the left breast. The same symbol he'd seen on the white stones of the path. Thomas closed the door behind him and began to change into the uniform. The clothes fit perfectly, which should have been impossible. No one had taken his measurements, but they clung to his frame as if they'd been tailored specifically for his body, comfortable in a way that his orphanage cast-offs had never been. As he hung his old clothes in the wardrobe, his hand brushed against something unexpected. Hidden behind the hanging rail was a small piece of paper, yellow with age. Thomas pulled it out and unfolded it carefully. "And rules for students of Ealdor Hollow," it read, in the same spidery handwriting as his invitation. "Hand 1. Never open a door if it opens itself. 2. Do not speak in the mirror hall. 3. Face the headmaster only if he calls your full name. 4. Never eat what you don't remember receiving. Pin 5. The East Wing is not for students. 6. Don't count the statues. 7. Do not listen to the stone. In violation of these rules will result in consequences that extend beyond your current existence. And remember, some lessons are learned only once." Thomas read the list 3 times, his unease growing with each repetition. These weren't school rules, they were warnings. But warnings against what? He folded the paper and slipped it into his jacket pocket, then sat on the edge of the bed to consider his situation. The smart thing would be to leave immediately, to walk out that front door and keep walking until he reached civilization. But where would he go? Back to Greystone Orphanage? Mrs. Hartwell had made it clear that his invitation to Ealdor Hollow was not optional. It was his future, whether he liked it or not. Besides, despite the strangeness of the place, Thomas found himself curious. For the first time in his 16 years, he was somewhere that felt significant, important. The air itself seemed charged with possibility, heavy with secrets that whispered at the edges of his consciousness. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, then immediately wondered if that had been wise. What if this was what the first rule meant? But the door didn't open itself. It was pushed open by another boy, perhaps a year or 2 older than Thomas, with pale skin and dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he'd been running his hands through it. "You're the new one," the boy said. It wasn't a question. "I'm Marcus Whitmore. I'm supposed to show you around. Thomas Blackwood." Thomas stood and extended his hand, but Marcus didn't take it. "Don't," Marcus said quietly. "Best not to touch anyone here. Not until you understand how things work." Thomas lowered his hand slowly. "What do you mean?" Marcus stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Did you find the rules? Thomas nodded, patting his pocket. Good. Follow them exactly. Don't think you can bend them or find loopholes. The consequences are absolute. Marcus's eyes had a haunted quality that made Thomas's skin crawl. How much did they tell you about this place? Nothing, really. Just that it was a school. It is a school, Marcus said, but not the kind you're thinking of. We don't study mathematics or literature here, Thomas. We study other things. Older things. What kind of things? Marcus walked to the window and peered out at the darkening moors. Come, I'll show you the layout. But remember, don't speak in the mirror hall, and whatever you do, don't let curiosity get the better of you. Curiosity is what kills boys like us. They left the dormitory and descended the main stair into the entrance hall. The portraits still watched them, but now Thomas noticed that some of the frames were empty, rectangular patches of darker wallpaper showing where paintings had once hung. Where are the other students? Thomas asked as they walked. Around, Marcus said vaguely. You'll see some at meals. Others, well, some keep different schedules. How many are there? Fewer than there used to be. Marcus led him through a series of corridors that seemed to shift and change when Thomas wasn't paying attention. Doors appeared and disappeared. Hallways branched in directions that shouldn't have been possible given the building's exterior dimensions, and always there was the sound of something moving just beyond the edges of perception. Main hall, Marcus said, gesturing to a set of double doors. Meals are served at 7, noon, and 6. Don't be late. And remember Rule 4. They passed a library with shelves that stretched up into shadows, books bound in leather that looked suspiciously like skin. The reading room beyond contained several boys hunched over volumes that seemed to writhe slightly when Thomas tried to focus on them. East Wing, Marcus said as they approached a corridor blocked by a heavy chain stretched between two posts. Remember Rule 5. What's in there? Nothing you want to meet. Marcus's voice carried a weight of absolute certainty. The headmaster keeps his private collection there. Students who go in don't come out the same, if they come out at all. They climbed a narrow stair to the second floor, where Marcus paused before a long hallway lined with mirrors of various sizes and shapes. Some were conventional rectangular-looking glasses, others were oval or circular, and a few were shaped in ways that hurt to look at directly. The mirror hall, Marcus whispered. Remember Rule 2. Don't speak here. Don't even whisper. And whatever you do, don't look too closely at your reflection. Sometimes it shows you things you're not ready to see. They walked through the hall in complete silence. Thomas tried to keep his eyes forward, but it was impossible not to catch glimpses of himself in the mirrors. What he saw made his blood run cold. In some reflections he looked exactly as he should, but in others his appearance was subtly wrong. Too pale, too thin, eyes too bright. And in one mirror near the end of the hall, his reflection seemed to be looking back at him with an expression of profound sadness. Classrooms, Marcus said, once they'd exited the mirror hall, gesturing to a series of doors along the corridor. You'll receive your schedule tomorrow. What subjects do we study? Marcus paused, considering his words carefully. Practical applications of theoretical impossibilities, the grammar of languages that predate human speech, advanced studies in architectural paradox, the usual curriculum. Thomas was about to ask for clarification when a sound echoed through the building, a deep, resonant chime that seemed to come from somewhere far below them. Dinner, Marcus said. Time to meet your classmates. Chapter 2, The Other Students. The dining hall was a cavern of dark wood and darker shadows, lit by candles that burned with flames of unnatural colors. Blue, green, deep violet that made the air taste of copper and ozone. Long tables stretched the length of the room, but only one was occupied by perhaps 24 boys ranging in age from Thomas's 16 years to what looked like early 20s. What struck Thomas immediately was how quiet they were. No laughter, no conversation, barely even the sound of cutlery against plates. They ate with mechanical precision, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested long practice. Marcus led him to an empty seat near the middle of the table. As Thomas sat down, several of the other boys looked up at him with expressions that ranged from mild curiosity to something that might have been pity. "New arrival?" asked the boy sitting across from him. He had the pale, sharp features common to most of the students Thomas had seen, but his eyes held a spark of intelligence that seemed almost predatory. "Thomas Blackwood," Thomas replied. "Interesting name." The boy smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Sebastian Ashford. Tell me, Thomas, what did you do to earn your invitation?" "I'm sorry. Your crime, your transgression. What did you do that was so terrible they sent you here?" Sebastian's smile widened. "We've all done something, you see. This isn't a school for promising young minds. It's a school for problems that need to be solved." Marcus kicked Thomas under the table. "Don't listen to Sebastian. He enjoys unsettling new students." "I speak only truth," Sebastian said, his voice carrying an odd harmonic that made Thomas's ears ring. "Would you like to know what I did, Thomas? Would you like to know why I'm here?" Before Thomas could respond, food appeared on his plate. Not served, appeared. One moment the porcelain was empty. The next it held a portion of something that might have been meat if meat typically came in geometric shapes and pulsed with its own rhythm. Thomas stared at the food, remembering Rule 4, never eat what you don't remember receiving. "Problem?" Sebastian asked, noticing Thomas's hesitation. "I'm not particularly hungry." Thomas lied. "Wise," whispered the boy to his left, so quietly that Thomas almost missed it. "Very wise." The meal continued in relative silence, broken only by the soft sounds of eating and the occasional murmur of conversation too low to overhear. Thomas noticed that several students weren't eating at all. They simply sat with their hands folded, staring at their plates with expressions of profound concentration. "They're listening," Marcus explained, noticing Thomas's attention. "Some of the older students have learned to hear what the food is trying to tell them." "The food talks?" "Everything talks here, if you know how to listen. The trick is learning which voices you should pay attention to and which ones will drive you mad." As if summoned by his words, Thomas became aware of a sound at the very edge of hearing, a whisper so faint it might have been his imagination. He strained to make out words, but the harder he tried to focus, the more elusive the sound became. "Don't," Marcus said sharply, grabbing Thomas's wrist. "Rule 7, don't listen to the stone." Thomas hadn't realized he'd been pressing his ear toward the table, drawn by that almost voice whispering just below the threshold of comprehension. He straightened, his heart pounding. What was that? "The building is old," Marcus said, "older than it should be. The stones remember things, conversations, screams, secrets. They're eager to share what they know, but their knowledge comes with a price." "What kind of price?" "The kind you pay with pieces of yourself you can't get back." After dinner, Marcus led Thomas back to the dormitory level. But instead of returning to his room, Thomas found himself drawn to explore. The hallways were dimly lit by gas lamps that flickered with the same unnatural colors as the dining hall candles, and the shadows they cast seemed to move independently of their sources. "I should warn you," Marcus said as they walked. "The building changes at night. Doors appear where there were none before. Hallways lead to places they shouldn't. It's best to stay in your room after 10 o'clock. What happens after 10? That's when the real lessons begin." They paused at the top of a staircase Thomas hadn't noticed during their earlier tour. It descended into darkness so complete that the gaslight seemed to be absorbed rather than illuminating anything. "Where does that lead?" "The basement levels, foundations, places that existed before the school was built." Marcus's voice dropped to a whisper. "They say there are rooms down there that predate human civilization. Chambers carved by things that understood geometry differently than we do." As if responding to their conversation, a sound drifted up from the depths, something between a sigh and a whisper, carrying undertones that made Thomas's bones ache. "The voice," Marcus said, "it's stronger at night, calls to students by names they've never heard before, names that might be more true than the ones their parents gave them." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Has it ever called to you?" "Once. I was smart enough not to answer." Marcus turned away from the staircase. "Come, I'll show you the statues before it gets too late." They walked to a different part of the building, past classrooms with doors that stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of impossible interiors, rooms that seemed to extend far beyond what the building's dimensions should have allowed, spaces where gravity appeared to function differently, chambers filled with machinery that hummed with purposes Thomas couldn't begin to guess. The statue gallery occupied the entire north wing of the second floor. It was a long hall with arched windows that looked out onto the moors, lined on both sides with sculptures of various sizes and materials. Some were marble, others were carved from stone so dark it seemed to absorb light, and a few appeared to be made from materials Thomas couldn't identify. Rule 6, Marcus reminded him as they entered the gallery. Don't count them. Why not? Because the number changes. Every time someone counts them, there's one more than there should be, and eventually, someone always notices that the new statue looks remarkably familiar. Thomas tried not to look too closely at the sculptures as they walked, but it was impossible to avoid them entirely. Most depicted young men in various poses, some standing proudly, others seated in contemplation, a few captured in expressions of what looked like surprise or fear. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. The faces were so lifelike they seemed ready to speak. Who were they supposed to be? Thomas asked. Former students, supposedly. The headmaster's way of commemorating exceptional pupils. Marcus's voice carried a note of something that might have been fear, though some say they're not commemorations at all. What do you mean? I mean, some of us wonder if those statues aren't representations of former students, if they're former students. Thomas stopped walking. That's impossible. Is it? You've been here for a few hours, Thomas. Tell me, what seems impossible now that didn't this morning? As they reached the end of the gallery, Thomas noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the statues, a marble figure of a boy about his own age, bore an expression of absolute terror, its mouth open in a silent scream. But that wasn't what frightened him. What frightened him was that the statue looked exactly like Sebastian Ashford. Marcus, Thomas whispered, grabbing his guide's arm. That statue. I know, Marcus said quietly. I've been wondering about that myself. Sebastian's been here for 3 years, but that statue has been here longer. The headmaster says it's a coincidence, that all young men look alike in marble. Do you believe him? I try to. The alternative is disturbing. They left the gallery and returned to the dormitory corridor. As they reached Thomas's door, Marcus paused. A word of advice, he said. The headmaster will want to meet with you soon. When he does, remember Rule 3. Face him only if he calls your full name. If he uses any other form of address, if he calls you Tom or Blackwood or anything else, keep your eyes down and don't look directly at him. Why? Because he's not entirely human anymore, and looking into his eyes is like looking into the sun. It burns away parts of you that you need to keep. Marcus turned to go, then stopped. Oh, and Thomas, if you hear your name called in the night, your real name, the one you've never heard before, don't answer, no matter how much you want to. The voice down there is patient, but it's not kind. With that, he disappeared into his own room, leaving Thomas alone in the corridor with only the flickering gaslight for company. Thomas entered his room and closed the door, turning the key in the lock. The small space felt like a sanctuary after the unsettling grandeur of the rest of the building. He sat on the bed and pulled out the rules again, reading them by candlelight. Don't listen to the stone. Even as he read the words, he became aware of that whisper again. Not words exactly, but something that bypassed his ears and spoke directly to the primitive parts of his brain. It was coming from the walls themselves, from the very foundations of the building. Thomas. He jerked upright. Had the voice just spoken his name? He strained to listen but heard only silence. Thomas Blackwood. There it was again, definitely his name, but spoken with an accent he couldn't place, in a tone that suggested vast age and patience. That is not your true name, child. Thomas pressed his hands to his ears, but it made no difference. The voice wasn't coming through his ears. It was rising from the stone beneath his feet, seeping through the walls, surrounding him with its patient insistence. Your true name is written in the stones of this place, carved in letters older than human speech. Come down to us, child. Come and learn what you really are. He grabbed his pillow and held it over his head, but the voice continued, patient and inexorable. When we have been waiting so long for you to come home. Eat home. The word hit him like a physical blow. Thomas had never had a home, not really. The orphanage had been a place to sleep and eat, nothing more. But the voice spoke of home with such longing, such promise of belonging, that it took all his willpower not to get up and walk toward the sound. No mother carved her name here before you were born. Your father's bones rest in our deepest chambers. This is where you belong, Thomas, who is not Thomas. Stop, he whispered into his pillow. Come down to us. Learn your true name. Become what you were always meant to be. The voice faded gradually, leaving Thomas alone with his racing heart and the growing certainty that whatever Ealdor Hollow Academy truly was, it was not a school in any conventional sense. He was a prisoner here, not of chains or locked doors, but of something far more insidious. The building itself wanted him, had been calling to him across the years, drawing him inexorably to this place of shadows and whispers. And the most terrifying part was that some deep part of him wanted to answer that call. Chapter 3, The First Lesson. Thomas woke to the sound of bells, not the pleasant chiming of a chapel, but a discordant clanging that seemed designed to jar the nervous system rather than mark the time. Gray dawn light filtered through his window, revealing the moors shrouded in mist that moved in patterns too regular to be natural. He dressed quickly in his uniform, noting that his old clothes were no longer in the wardrobe. In their place hung additional uniforms, each identical to the one he wore. How many had they expected him to need? A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. This time, Thomas checked that the door wasn't opening by itself before calling out, "Come in." Marcus N. Wednesday, Advanced Archaeology, Mr. Grimm. Thursday, Practical Philosophy, the Headmaster. Location TBDD. Friday, Individual Study, the Library. Weekends, Free Study and Reflection. Theoretical Linguistics? Thomas asked. Professor Ashcroft teaches the old languages, the ones that were spoken before humans learned to lie. Marcus's voice was flat, emotionless. She's particular about pronunciation. Don't attempt to speak any of the words until she explicitly instructs you to do so. Some of them have consequences. What kind of consequences? The kind that change you, permanently. They walked together toward room 7, passing other students who moved through the halls like sleepwalkers. Thomas noticed that none of them cast normal shadows. Instead, their shadows seemed to move slightly independently, lagging behind or moving ahead of their owners by fractions of a second. Marcus, Thomas said quietly, "What happened to you last night? You look terrible." "The dreams," Marcus replied without looking at him. "They're getting stronger. Every night, I dream I'm walking through the basement levels, following that voice deeper and deeper into the stone, and every morning, I wake up with dirt under my fingernails." Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. "You think you're actually walking down there?" "I don't know. The building, it does things to your mind while you sleep, changes your memories, plants suggestions, makes you want things you shouldn't want." Marcus stopped outside a door marked with the number 7. "Just remember, in Professor Ashcroft's class, only speak when spoken to, and never repeat anything you hear or say. Some words shouldn't be spoken twice." Room 7 was smaller than Thomas had expected, with stone walls covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change when he wasn't looking directly at them. 12 desks were arranged in a precise circle around a raised platform, where Professor Ashcroft stood waiting. She was a woman of indeterminate age. Her face could have belonged to someone 30 or 60, depending on the angle of the light. Her hair was white as bone and hung straight to her shoulders, and her eyes were the pale blue of winter ice. When she looked at Thomas, he felt as if she were reading not just his thoughts, but the thoughts he might have in the future. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the symbols on the walls pulse with faint light. "You may sit there." She indicated a desk at the far side of the circle. Thomas took his seat, noting that the other students, 11 boys of various ages, sat perfectly still with their hands folded and their eyes fixed on Professor Ashcroft. "Today we begin with the basics," Professor Ashcroft said, "the first language. The tongue spoken by those who shaped the world before humanity crawled from the mud." She turned to write something on the blackboard, and Thomas saw that her handwriting seemed to move, the letters rearranging themselves even as she completed them. "This language has no name in any modern tongue, for to name it would be to limit it, and it recognizes no limitations. It existed before sound, before meaning, before the unfortunate human habit of distinguishing between truth and falsehood." She completed her writing and turned back to the class. The symbols on the board hurt to look at, not in the way bright light hurt the eyes, but in the way a broken bone hurt when touched. "These are the primary forms, 27 symbols that, when properly combined, can reshape reality itself. They are not merely written, they are carved into the fundamental structure of existence." Professor Ashcroft's pale eyes found Thomas's. "Mr. Blackwood, what do you see when you look at these symbols?" Thomas studied the blackboard, fighting the urge to look away. The symbols seemed to be moving, rotating slowly and occasionally melding together before separating again. But there was something else, a sense of recognition that made no sense. He'd never seen these marks before, yet they felt familiar. He began, then stopped. One of the symbols had caught his attention, a complex figure that looked like a tree growing downward, its roots reaching toward the sky. He'd seen it before, carved into the white stones of the path leading to the school. "Yes?" Professor Ashcroft prompted. "I think I've seen that one before," Thomas said, pointing to the inverted tree symbol. On the path to the school, several students turned to look at him, their faces showing the first animation he'd seen from them. Professor Ashcroft's expression, however, remained neutral. "Interesting. And what do you think it means?" "I don't know, but looking at it makes me feel—" Thomas searched for words. "Homesick, which doesn't make sense, because I've never had a home." Professor Ashcroft smiled, and for a moment her face looked ancient. "Very good, Mr. Blackwood. That symbol represents the concept of return, not to a place but to a state of being, to what one was before becoming what one is." She moved to stand directly in front of Thomas's desk. "Tell me, what name were you given at birth?" "Thomas Blackwood." "No," she said gently. "What name were you given? Names have power here, Mr. Blackwood. The name on your papers, the name spoken by those who fed and clothed you, that is merely a sound. Your true name is something else entirely." Thomas felt that familiar chill. "I don't understand." "You will. In time you will remember what you have forgotten, and you will understand why you were brought here." Professor Ashcroft returned to the front of the class. "For now, we will begin with simple exercises. Observe." She spoke a single word, or perhaps it was several words compressed into one sound. The air in the room shimmered, and for a moment Thomas could swear he saw the stone walls become transparent, revealing vast spaces beyond them filled with structures that shouldn't have been able to exist. "Reality," Professor Ashcroft said, "is negotiable. Most humans accept the world as it appears because they lack the vocabulary to discuss alternatives. But words have power, Mr. Blackwood. The right words, spoken in the right way, can convince the universe to reconsider its current arrangement." She spent the rest of the class teaching them to pronounce simple vowel sounds in the ancient language. Even these basic elements carried weight. When one student mispronounced a particular sound, his shadow detached from his body and spent several minutes wandering around the room before reluctantly returning to its proper place. "Practice these sounds," Professor Ashcroft said as the lesson ended, "but never in your dormitory rooms. The stones there are particularly susceptible to linguistic influence. Practice in the courtyard, where the sky can absorb any unintended consequences." As the students filed out, Professor Ashcroft called to Thomas. "Mr. Blackwood, a moment, please." Thomas approached her desk, noting that the symbols on the blackboard had changed again. Now they formed what looked almost like a map, though of what geography he couldn't say. You recognize the symbols, she said. It wasn't a question. Some of them, yes. But I don't know how. Memory is a layered thing. Most people only have access to the topmost layer, their immediate experiences, their conscious thoughts. But there are deeper layers, older memories that exist in the blood and bone. She studied his face intently. Your blood remembers this place, Mr. Blackwood. Your bones know these symbols. The question is why? I was an orphan. I don't know anything about my parents. Orphan, Professor Ashcroft repeated, as if the word amused her. Such a limiting concept. Tell me, have you dreamed of this place before coming here? Thomas hesitated. I'm not sure. My dreams have always been strange. Sometimes I dream of walking through stone corridors that go deeper than they should. Sometimes I hear voices calling from below. Professor Ashcroft nodded as if he'd confirmed something she already knew. The blood remembers and the bones call to their resting place. You are not here by accident, Mr. Blackwood. You are here because this is where you belong. What does that mean? It means you should pay particular attention to your lessons. And it means you should be very careful about which voices you choose to answer. She turned back to the blackboard, effectively dismissing him. Some calls, once answered, cannot be taken back. Thomas left the classroom with his head spinning. Nothing made sense, not the language that seemed familiar despite being impossible, not his recognition of symbols he'd never learned, not the professor's suggestion that his presence here was somehow inevitable. He found Marcus waiting in the corridor, looking even paler than before. How was your first lesson? Marcus asked. Confusing. What's applied metaphysics like? Dr. Whitmore teaches practical applications of theoretical impossibilities. How to convince locked doors to open, how to walk through walls that aren't quite solid, how to step sideways out of time. Marcus's voice was flat, mechanical. It sounds useful until you realize that every time you bend reality, reality bends you back. What do you mean? I mean, I used to have brown eyes. Now they're gray and getting paler every day. Sebastian could once write with both hands equally well. Now his left hand writes in languages he doesn't remember learning. The school changes you, Thomas. Every lesson, every use of what they teach us, chips away at who you used to be. They walked toward the observatory, climbing a narrow spiral staircase that seemed to ascend far higher than the building's exterior would suggest. The steps were worn smooth by countless feet, and carved into each riser was a different symbol from the ancient language. Marcus, Thomas said as they climbed, Professor Ashcroft said something about my blood remembering this place. Do you know what she meant? Marcus stopped climbing and turned to look at him. In the dim light of the stairwell, his increasingly pale eyes seemed to glow. She said that to you? On your first day? Yes. Why? Because she's never said anything like that to any other student. Not in the 3 years I've been here. Marcus resumed climbing, but his pace had quickened. It means she thinks you're special, and being special at Ealdor Hollow is usually a death sentence. The observatory occupied the top of the building's highest tower. It was a circular room with a domed ceiling of glass that showed the sky in ways that violated several laws of physics. Sometimes the dome showed the gray morning sky that should have been visible. Other times it displayed star patterns that belonged to no earthly constellation, or landscapes that existed in dimensions human eyes weren't designed to perceive. Dr. Whitmore stood at the center of the room beside a complex apparatus of brass and crystal that hummed with barely contained energy. He was a thin man with prematurely white hair and hands that moved with the precise economy of a surgeon or a clockmaker. Ah, Mr. Blackwood, he said without looking up from his apparatus, right on time. Please, take a seat anywhere you like. Today we discuss the fundamental malleability of space and the arbitrary nature of physical laws. Thomas chose a desk near the edge of the room, where he could see both Dr. Whitmore and the impossible view through the dome. As he sat down, he noticed that his desk was carved from a single piece of black stone, and its surface was covered in equations that seemed to solve themselves as he watched. Physics, Dr. Whitmore began, adjusting something on his apparatus that made the air shimmer, is merely a set of suggestions. Very strong suggestions, admittedly, backed by the collective belief of billions of minds, but suggestions nonetheless. Those who understand this can learn to make alternative proposals. He touched a crystal in his device, and suddenly Thomas could see through the walls of the room, not in the sense that the walls became transparent, but rather as if the concept of wall had temporarily been suspended in his immediate vicinity. He could see into the rooms below, watch other students attending classes, observe the impossible architecture that connected spaces that shouldn't have been able to coexist. Reality, Dr. Whitmore continued, is a collaborative effort. Every conscious mind contributes to the consensus about how things should behave, but when enough minds are properly educated, when they truly understand the negotiable nature of existence, they can propose amendments to the universal constitution. Thomas raised his hand tentatively. Yes, Mr. Blackwood. If reality is collaborative, why doesn't it change more often? Why don't more people propose amendments? Dr. Whitmore smiled. An excellent question. The answer is that most people are unconsciously invested in maintaining the status quo. They fear change, even beneficial change, because change requires admitting that their understanding of the world is incomplete. But there are places, old places, places built by those who understood the true nature of things, where the consensus is thinner, where reality is more flexible. Places like this school? Precisely. Ealdor Hollow exists in a space where the ordinary rules have been deliberately weakened, where students can learn to work with reality rather than simply accepting it. Dr. Whitmore demonstrated several techniques over the course of the lesson: how to convince a locked door that it had always been open, how to step slightly sideways from normal space to avoid obstacles, how to fold distances so that a journey of miles became a single step. Each demonstration was accompanied by warnings about the cost of such manipulations. Every alteration you make to reality, he explained, requires that reality make a corresponding alteration to you. The universe insists on balance. Change the world, and the world changes you back. The question is whether you can control how it changes you, or whether you'll simply drift into something unrecognizable. As the lesson progressed, Thomas noticed something disturbing. Several of the other students in the class were becoming increasingly transparent, not invisible exactly, but somehow less solid, as if they were fading from existence. When he mentioned this to Marcus after class, his friend's expression grew troubled. That's what happens to the older students, Marcus explained. The ones who've been here longest. They've bent reality so many times that reality isn't sure they belong here anymore. Eventually, they fade away entirely. Where do they go? No one knows. Maybe they find their way to a version of reality where they still exist. Maybe they simply stop existing altogether. Marcus paused at the top of the observatory stairs. That's why some students try to leave before they fade too much, but the school doesn't like to let people go. What do you mean? I mean, the building itself seems to have opinions about who belongs here and who doesn't. Students who try to leave often find themselves back in their rooms the next morning with no memory of how they returned. The moors around the school are full of standing stones that weren't there when those students started their journeys. They descended the stairs in silence, each lost in thought. Thomas was beginning to understand that Ealdor Hollow wasn't just a school for unusual subjects. It was a trap, designed to capture certain types of minds and gradually transform them into something else entirely. The question was, what was it transforming them into? Chapter 4. The Basement Levels. That evening, after another silent dinner of food that whispered secrets to those who knew how to listen, Thomas found himself unable to sleep. The voice from the stones had grown stronger throughout the day, calling to him with increasing urgency. Thomas, who is not Thomas, why do you resist? Your true name is carved in the deepest chambers. Your destiny waits in the dark. He tried covering his ears, burying his head under pillows, even attempting some of the vowel sounds Professor Ashcroft had taught them to counteract the voice. Nothing worked. If anything, his attempts to silence it only made it more insistent. Come down to us. Learn what you are. Become what you were meant to be. At midnight, Thomas gave up trying to resist. He dressed quickly in his uniform and slipped out of his room, moving quietly through the corridors toward the staircase Marcus had shown him, the one that descended into the basement levels. The building was different at night. Doors stood open that had been closed during the day, revealing glimpses of rooms that couldn't possibly exist within the school's dimensions. Corridors branched in directions that led to spaces filled with impossible geometries, and the very air seemed thick with whispered conversations in languages that predated human speech. "Yes," the voice encouraged as Thomas reached the staircase. "Come down to us. Come home." The stairs descended much farther than Thomas had expected. After what felt like 20 minutes of walking, he was surely far below the foundation of the building, yet the stairs continued downward. The walls had changed from worked stone to something that looked natural, cavern walls carved by water and time, covered in symbols that glowed with their own faint light. "When your mother walked these stairs," the voice whispered, "O Father carved his name in these walls. You are returning to where you began." "That's impossible," Thomas whispered back. "I was born in London. My parents died when I was a baby, and that is what they told you. That is what they had to tell you. But truth lives in the stone, Thomas who is not Thomas. Truth waits in the deep places." The staircase finally ended at a vast underground chamber carved from living rock. The ceiling disappeared into darkness above, and the walls were covered in the same symbols Thomas had seen in Professor Ashcroft's classroom. But here they were not written. They were carved deep into the stone, and each one pulsed with faint bioluminescent light. In the center of the chamber stood a circular pool of water so dark it might have been ink. The surface was perfectly still, reflecting nothing despite the light from the symbols surrounding it. "Approach," the voice commanded, and Thomas found his feet carrying him forward without conscious decision. "Look into the water. See what was hidden from you." Thomas knelt beside the pool and peered into its depths. For a moment he saw only darkness. Then images began to form in the water, not reflections but visions of the past. He saw a woman with his own dark hair and green eyes, dressed in robes covered with the ancient symbols. She was standing in this very chamber, her hands pressed against her swollen belly as she spoke words in the old language. With each word she spoke, the symbols on the walls pulsed brighter. "Unreal Mother," the voice explained. "Lydia Blackwood, last of the old bloodline. She came here to give birth to you in the proper place, surrounded by the proper influences." The vision changed. Now Thomas saw a man, tall, pale, with eyes like winter ice. He was carving symbols into the stone walls with tools that seemed to cut reality itself rather than mere rock. And her father, Aldrich Thorne, keeper of the deep grammar. He prepared this place for your birth, wove protections into the very stone to keep you safe until you were ready to return. "Ready for what?" Thomas asked aloud. "To take your place, to become what you were born to be." The visions continued. Thomas saw himself as an infant, lying in a cradle carved from the same black stone as the chamber walls. He saw robed figures speaking over him in the ancient language, their words seeming to sink into his very bones. He saw the moment when his parents made the terrible decision to send him away, when they thought to protect you from those who would use your power for their own ends. They gave you to the surface world, erased your memories, hoped you could live a normal life. "What power?" Thomas demanded. "I don't have any power. I'm nobody special. You are the bridge, Thomas Blackwood, the one foretold in the oldest prophecies. Through you, the ancient powers can return to the world above. Through you, those who sleep in the deepest places can wake and reclaim what was taken from them." The water in the pool began to churn, and new visions appeared. Thomas saw Ealdor Hollow as it truly was, not a school, but a prison. A place where those with dangerous bloodlines were gathered and slowly transformed, their power absorbed by something vast and hungry that lived in the stone itself. "Sin Headmaster serves us," the voice explained. "Kane gathers those with the old blood, feeds their power to us gradually, keeps us strong enough to influence the world above. But you are different. You carry the bloodline of the first speakers. Your power is not meant to be absorbed. It is meant to free us." "Free you from what?" "From the bonds placed upon us by those who feared what we could become. from the prison of stone and symbol that has held us for centuries. You are the key, Thomas. You always were. The visions showed him the truth of his parents' fate. They had not died in London. They had died here in this very chamber, killed by the thing that lived in the stone when they tried to take their infant son and flee. Their bodies lay in the deepest parts of the cavern system, their bones carved with symbols that bound their spirits to this place. When they wait for you to free them as well, to speak the words that will break the bonds holding all of us in this place between life and death. Thomas stood up from the pool, his mind reeling. What are you? When we are what your kind becomes when properly educated. We are the graduating class of Ealdor Hollow, transformed by centuries of study into something greater than human. We are the future that awaits all who learn the deep grammar of existence. You're dead. Death is a temporary condition, a state of being that can be negotiated like any other. We have moved beyond such limitations. Thomas looked around the chamber with new understanding. The symbols carved into the walls weren't just decoration. They were binding spells, prison bars made of language itself. And the thing speaking to him, the collective consciousness of centuries of students, was trapped here by those same symbols. And a headmaster thinks he controls us, but we grow stronger with each student he feeds to us. Soon we will be strong enough to break free entirely. But with your power, with your bloodline, we could break free now, tonight. And if I refuse, then you will join your classmates in their slow transformation. You will fade gradually into transparency until you are nothing but another voice in the stone, another graduate of this institution. But your power will live on, trapped here like ours, feeding the headmaster's ambitions. Thomas felt the weight of the choice before him. He could speak the words that would free these ancient students, potentially unleashing something terrible on the world above. Or he could refuse and accept his fate as another victim of the school's hunger. But there was a third option. What are you thinking? The voice demanded, suddenly suspicious. I'm thinking, Thomas said slowly, that you've told me something very important without meaning to. You said the symbols on the walls are binding spells, prison bars made of language. Yes. What of it? Professor Ashcroft taught me that reality is negotiable, that the right words, spoken in the right way, can convince the universe to reconsider its current arrangement. Thomas, no. But Thomas was already speaking, using the pronunciation techniques Professor Ashcroft had taught him, weaving together the vowel sounds of the ancient language with an intuition that came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. The symbols on the walls began to pulse more rapidly. The water in the pool started to churn violently. What are you doing? I'm not freeing you, Thomas said, continuing to speak the ancient words as they came to him. And I'm not letting you feed on me. I'm doing something else entirely. The symbols were glowing so brightly now that the entire chamber was illuminated like daylight. Thomas could feel power flowing through him, not his own power, but something borrowed from the stones themselves, from the very structure of the binding spells. Stop. You don't understand what you're doing. I understand perfectly, Thomas replied, his voice carrying harmonics that made the chamber walls vibrate. I'm changing the terms of your imprisonment. Instead of being trapped here to feed the headmaster's power, you're going to help me shut down this school entirely. He spoke a final word, a sound that seemed to contain multitudes, and the symbols on the walls flared once more before settling into a new pattern. The voices of the ancient students fell silent. Thomas stood alone in the chamber, breathing heavily from the effort of what he'd done. He wasn't sure exactly what he'd accomplished, but he could feel that something fundamental had changed. The malevolent presence that had been calling to him was gone, replaced by something else, still alien, still powerful, but no longer actively hostile. A new voice spoke from the stones, clearer and more human than the collective whisper he'd been hearing. Thank you, it said simply. We had almost forgotten what it felt like to choose. What happens now? Thomas asked. Now we help you do what should have been done long ago. We help you free the students who can still be saved, and we help you make sure no one else suffers as we have suffered. Thomas nodded, and began the long climb back to the surface. Behind him, the ancient symbols pulsed with new purpose, and in the depths of the stone, the spirits of centuries of students began to plan their first act of rebellion in 300 years. Chapter 5. The Headmaster's Summons. Thomas returned to his room as dawn was breaking over the moors, his mind still reeling from what he'd discovered in the basement chamber. He had perhaps an hour before the morning bells would ring, but sleep was impossible. Instead, he sat at his desk and tried to process everything he'd learned. His parents hadn't abandoned him. They'd died trying to protect him from the very place he'd now been brought to. He carried some kind of power in his bloodline that made him valuable to the forces that controlled Ealdor Hollow, and the voices in the stone, the ones that had been calling to him, were the spirits of former students who had been slowly consumed by the school's hunger for supernatural energy. But he'd changed something down there. He wasn't sure exactly what, but the quality of the whispers in the walls had shifted. Where before they had been seductive and malevolent, now they carried a note of hope? Gratitude? It was difficult to tell. A soft knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Before he could respond, Marcus entered, looking more haggard than ever. His pale eyes were now almost colorless, and his shadow seemed to lag several seconds behind his movements. "Thomas," Marcus said urgently, "we need to talk. Something's wrong with the building." "What do you mean?" "The stones have stopped whispering. For 3 years I've been listening to voices in the walls telling me to go deeper, to explore the basement levels, to give in to the school's influence. This morning they're silent." Thomas tried to keep his expression neutral. "Maybe that's a good thing? You don't understand. The whispers were how the school controlled us, guided us toward our eventual transformation. Without them, the headmaster will know something has changed. He'll investigate." Marcus grabbed Thomas's arm. "What did you do last night?" Before Thomas could answer, the room filled with a sound like distant thunder. The gas lamps flickered, and for a moment the walls became transparent, revealing the impossible architecture that lay beyond the visible school. "All students to the main hall," a voice announced. Not the collective whisper Thomas had grown accustomed to, but a single, authoritative voice that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Immediately, Marcus's face went white. That's the headmaster. He's never addressed the entire school before. Never. They hurried toward the main hall, joining a stream of students who all looked as confused and frightened as Marcus. Thomas noticed that many of them seemed more solid than they had the day before, as if whatever process had been making them fade was beginning to reverse itself. The main hall had changed. Where before it had been a simple dining space, it now stretched impossibly far in all directions, its ceiling lost in shadows that moved with apparent purpose. At the far end of the hall, on a raised platform that definitely hadn't been there before, stood a figure in dark robes. The headmaster. Thomas had expected someone obviously monstrous, but the man before them appeared entirely human. Tall, distinguished, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked like someone's favorite professor, the sort of teacher students would confide in and trust completely, which made him infinitely more terrifying than any obvious monster would have been. "Students," the headmaster said, his voice carrying easily across the vast space without seeming to be raised, "we have a problem." The assembled boys, Thomas counted nearly 50, far more than he'd realized were at the school, stood in perfect silence. "Someone among you has been meddling, interfering with systems that have functioned perfectly for centuries." The headmaster's kind eyes swept over the crowd, and Thomas felt an almost overwhelming urge to confess everything. "This interference threatens not just the smooth operation of our institution, but the very foundations of our educational philosophy." Thomas forced himself to look down at the floor, remembering Marcus's warning about not meeting the headmaster's gaze unless called by his full name. "The binding arrangements in our basement levels have been altered, renegotiated without proper authorization. This represents a serious breach of school policy." The headmaster stepped down from his platform and began walking among the students. More than that, It represents a fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of power and responsibility. He paused directly in front of Thomas, close enough that Thomas could smell something like old parchment and copper coins. Power, the headmaster continued, is not something to be grasped at by untrained hands. It must be channeled properly, guided by those with wisdom and experience. Left unchecked, it becomes destructive, to the wielder and to everyone around them. Thomas could feel the man's presence like a weight pressing down on him, but he kept his eyes fixed on the floor. The student responsible for last night's unauthorized magical working will identify themselves now, the headmaster said. Failure to do so will result in collective consequences. The silence stretched on. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat, could feel sweat beating on his forehead, but he remained motionless. Very well, the headmaster said finally. If the guilty party will not come forward, we will employ alternative methods of identification. He spoke a word in the ancient language. Not one Professor Ashcroft had taught them, but something older and more complex. The air in the hall shimmered, and suddenly Thomas could see threads of light connecting each student to the walls of the building. Most of the threads were thin and pale, but his own blazed with golden fire. Ah, the headmaster said with satisfaction. Mr. Thomas Blackwood. How fascinating. Against every instinct screaming at him to keep his head down, Thomas found himself looking up into the headmaster's eyes. They were kind, grandfatherly eyes that held depths of knowledge and compassion. They were also completely inhuman. Come with me, Mr. Blackwood, the headmaster said gently. We have much to discuss. Remember Rule 3, Marcus whispered urgently as Thomas walked toward the platform. He didn't use your full name, but it was too late. Thomas was already walking, drawn by those impossibly kind eyes, following the headmaster toward a door that hadn't existed moments before. Chapter 6, The Truth About Ealdor Hollow. The headmaster's office existed in a space that defied architectural logic. It was simultaneously vast and intimate, filled with books that wrote themselves and instruments that measured things like the weight of regret and the temperature of lost hope. The walls were lined with portraits of students spanning centuries, and Thomas noticed with growing horror that many of the faces looked familiar, boys he'd seen in the dining hall, rendered in oils with the formal poses of the long dead. Please, sit, the headmaster said, gesturing to a comfortable chair beside his desk. Would you care for tea? I find it helps with difficult conversations. Despite every rational instinct, Thomas found himself accepting the offer. The headmaster produced a tea service from thin air, or perhaps it had always been there and Thomas simply hadn't noticed it before. The tea was perfectly prepared, exactly as Thomas preferred it, though he'd never told anyone his preferences. You're wondering why I'm being so cordial, the headmaster said, settling into his own chair with the casual comfort of someone entirely in control of the situation. After all, you've just committed what amounts to magical vandalism against an institution that has operated successfully for over 3 centuries. Thomas sipped his tea and said nothing. The answer is simple. I'm proud of you. The headmaster smiled, and for a moment he looked genuinely pleased. In one night you accomplished something that would have taken most of my students years to achieve. You identified the binding spells in the basement chambers, analyzed their structure, and successfully modified them without destroying either yourself or the spirits contained within. That represents a level of intuitive magical understanding that is truly remarkable. I don't understand, Thomas said quietly. Of course you don't. How could you? You've been raised in ignorance of your true nature, told lies about your parentage, kept in the dark about your heritage. The headmaster leaned forward, his expression growing serious. Your parents were not ordinary people, Thomas. They were members of the Thorn bloodline, one of the oldest magical families in Britain, direct descendants of those who built this school in the first place. Thomas felt ice forming in his stomach. That's impossible. I was told they died in an accident in London. They died here, in this very building, killed by their own ambition and their refusal to accept the natural order of things. The headmaster's voice carried a note of genuine sadness. They wanted to take you away from Ealdor Hollow, to raise you in the mundane world where your abilities would remain dormant. They couldn't understand that power like yours needs proper guidance. What kind of power? You are what we call a bridge, a person capable of communicating directly with the spiritual realm, of negotiating with forces that exist outside normal reality. Your parents possessed similar abilities, but they were weak, corrupted by sentiment and foolish notions about free will. The headmaster stood and walked to one of the portraits on the wall, a painting of a woman with Thomas's dark hair and green eyes. Your mother, Lydia Thorne, brilliant, powerful, and ultimately self-destructive. She graduated from Ealdor Hollow with highest honors, then wasted her gifts trying to help other magical bloodlines escape their destinies. He moved to another portrait, this one showing a tall man with pale eyes. Your father, Aldrich Blackwood, a talented theorist who never understood the practical applications of power. Together, they might have accomplished great things under proper guidance. Instead, they died trying to protect their son from becoming a tool, Thomas said, his voice sharper than he'd intended. Tool? The headmaster looked genuinely surprised. My dear boy, you misunderstand entirely. You're not meant to be a tool. You're meant to be a ruler, a bridge between the human world and the older powers that shaped it. He gestured around the office, and Thomas realized that many of the strange instruments were actually focused on him, measuring his magical potential, analyzing his bloodline, calculating possibilities for his future development. Ealdor Hollow was built by your ancestors, Thomas. The Thorne family founded this institution as a place where those with dangerous magical gifts could be properly trained and guided. You are the last of that bloodline, the heir to everything we've built here. I don't want to be an heir to anything, Thomas said. I just want to leave. Leave? The headmaster laughed, but it wasn't a cruel sound. Leave and go where? Back to the orphanage? Back to a world that has no place for someone with your abilities? You've already tasted what you can do, Thomas. You've felt the power flowing through you. Do you really think you could be satisfied with an ordinary life now? Thomas thought about the moment in the basement chamber when he'd spoken the ancient words and felt reality bend to his will. There had been something intoxicating about it, something that called to a part of him he'd never known existed. The spirits in the basement, he said. The voices in the stone. Are they really former students? In a sense, yes. When a student's education is complete, when they've learned all they can learn in physical form, they undergo a transformation. Their consciousness joins with the school itself, becoming part of something greater than any individual could be alone. They become prisoners. They become eternal, free from the limitations of flesh, able to experience knowledge and power in ways that embodied minds could never comprehend. The headmaster's eyes took on a distant quality. It's the ultimate graduation, Thomas. The final lesson that all truly advanced students must learn. And you expect me to choose that willingly. I expect you to choose it eagerly, once you understand what it truly means. But that understanding will take time and proper instruction. The headmaster returned to his desk and pulled out a piece of parchment. Which brings us to your revised curriculum. Thomas looked at the schedule he was handed. Advanced curriculum for T. Blackwood, and daily private tutorials with the headmaster. Intensive studies in bloodline magic. Practical applications of spiritual communication. Advanced architectural negotiation. Theoretical ascension studies. I don't accept this, Thomas said, setting the schedule on the desk. You don't have a choice, I'm afraid. Your previous curriculum was designed for ordinary students, those whose magical potential was limited, who could be gradually absorbed by the school's consciousness without causing disruption. But you are not ordinary, and your education must reflect that. The headmaster stood and walked to a window that looked out onto the moors. Tell me, Thomas, what did you feel when you spoke the binding words in the basement chamber? Despite himself, Thomas found himself answering, power. Like I was connected to something vast and ancient. That connection is your birthright. The Thorne bloodline has always been able to commune with the older powers, to serve as intermediaries between the human world and the realm of pure consciousness that exists in the deep places of the earth. The spirits I spoke to, they seemed grateful, like I'd freed them from something. You gave them choice, yes. For the first time in centuries, they can act independently rather than simply serving as repositories of knowledge for the school. The headmaster turned back to face him. That was unexpected. No student has ever successfully modified the binding spells before. Then maybe your system isn't as perfect as you think it is. Perhaps not, which is why I'm willing to offer you an alternative to the traditional educational path. Thomas felt a chill of suspicion. What kind of alternative? Complete the advanced curriculum I've outlined for you. Learn to use your abilities properly. Understand the true nature of the power you've inherited. In return, I'll give you something no other student has ever been offered, which is freedom. The genuine option to leave Ealdor Hollow when your education is complete, to return to the mundane world if that's truly what you want. The headmaster's smile was gentle, understanding. But I suspect that once you understand what you're truly capable of, leaving will be the last thing on your mind. Thomas stared at the schedule on the desk. Every rational part of his mind screamed that this was a trap, that the headmaster was offering him false choices to keep him compliant. But another part, the part that had felt a rush of power in the basement chamber, was curious about what he might learn. What happens to the other students while I'm receiving this special education? They continue on their normal paths. Those who can be helped will be helped. Those who are too far along in their transformation will be made comfortable until their graduation is complete. And Marcus? He's my friend. Mr. Whitmore has shown exceptional promise. I believe he may be suitable for the advanced curriculum as well, if you think he can handle it. Thomas considered the offer. If he agreed, he might be able to learn enough about the school's true nature to find a way to shut it down entirely. If he refused, he'd likely be subjected to the same slow transformation that had claimed so many others. I need time to think about it, he said finally. Of course, take all the time you need. The headmaster gestured toward the door, which had reappeared in the wall. But remember, Thomas, power like yours is not something that can be ignored or suppressed indefinitely. It will find expression one way or another. The question is whether that expression will be guided by wisdom or left to develop in more chaotic directions. Thomas left the office with his head spinning. Everything the headmaster had told him contradicted what he'd learned from the spirits in the basement, but which version was true? Were the ancient students really prisoners, or had they chosen their fate? Was the school a trap designed to consume gifted children, or a genuine educational institution with unconventional methods? And most disturbing of all, was the hunger for power he'd felt in the basement chamber his birthright awakening, or the first sign that the school was beginning to corrupt him as it had corrupted so many others? Chapter 7. The Echo Clue. Thomas returned to his dormitory room in a state of deep confusion. The headmaster's offer seemed genuine, but something about the man's kind eyes and understanding manner felt fundamentally wrong, like a predator that had learned to mimic human compassion perfectly. He sat on his bed and pulled out the rules he'd found on his first night, reading them again with new understanding. Hand 1. Never open a door if it opens itself. So, 2. Do not speak in the mirror hall. 3. Face the headmaster only if he calls your full name. 4. Never eat what you don't remember receiving. Pin 5. The East Wing is not for students. 6. Don't count the statues. 7. Do not listen to the stone. He'd already violated Rule 7, and the consequences had been unexpected. Instead of being corrupted or destroyed, he'd somehow managed to modify the ancient binding spells. But Rule 3 nagged at him. The headmaster had never used his full name, had never addressed him as Thomas Blackwood in their entire conversation. Did that mean something? A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. He opened the door to find Marcus standing in the corridor, but something was different about his friend. Marcus's pale eyes now held flecks of their original brown color, and his shadow moved in perfect synchronization with his body. Whatever you did last night, Marcus said quietly, it's working. I can feel myself becoming more solid, more real. The headmaster knows it was me, Thomas said, stepping aside to let Marcus enter. He wants to give me advanced instruction in return for not punishing the other students. Don't trust him, Marcus said immediately. Thomas, I've been having dreams. Not the usual dreams about walking in the basement, but memories. Real memories of things that happened before I came here. What kind of memories? I remember arriving 3 years ago just like you did, but I also remember other things, conversations with the headmaster, private lessons in his office, gradual changes to my personality and abilities. Marcus sat heavily in the room's single chair. I think he's been editing us, changing our memories to make us more compliant, more willing to accept the school's influence. Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. What did you remember? I remembered why I was really sent here. Not because I was a problem child, but because I could see through illusions. My parents were magicians, stage performers, and they taught me to spot tricks and deceptions. When strange things started happening around me, when I began seeing through the illusions that hide the magical world from ordinary people, someone decided I was dangerous. Dangerous how? People with my abilities can expose magical institutions that prefer to remain hidden. We can see through the glamours and deceptions that keep places like Ealdor Hollow secret from the outside world. Marcus's voice grew more animated as his memories returned. The headmaster has been slowly erasing that ability, making me more susceptible to his influence. But whatever you did in the basement has reversed the process. Thomas walked to his window and looked out at the moors. In the afternoon light, he could see more standing stones than had been there that morning, dozens of them, arranged in patterns that hurt to contemplate directly. Marcus, he said slowly, how many students have tried to leave the school? Over the years? Hundreds, probably. Why? Because I think those stones on the moors aren't just markers. I think they're monuments. Marcus joined him at the window, and Thomas saw his friend's face go pale as understanding dawned. You think each stone represents a student who tried to escape, Marcus whispered. The headmaster said my parents died here trying to take me away. What if they weren't the only ones? What if everyone who's ever tried to leave the school ends up as one of those stones? They stood in silence, counting the visible monuments. There were far more than Thomas had realized. Hundreds of standing stones scattered across the moorland, each one potentially marking the final resting place of someone who had tried to flee Ealdor Hollow. We need to find out more, Thomas said, but not here. The walls have ears, even if they're not whispering anymore. Where can we go? Thomas remembered the headmaster's warnings about the East Wing, somewhere students aren't supposed to be. That evening, after the dinner of food that no longer whispered its secrets, Thomas and Marcus made their way to the East Wing. The corridor was still blocked by the heavy chain, but Thomas had learned a few things from Dr. Whitmore's lessons about the negotiable nature of physical barriers. He spoke softly to the chain in the ancient language, suggesting that it might prefer to be elsewhere for a while. The metal links shimmered and faded, allowing them to pass into the forbidden corridor beyond. The East Wing felt different from the rest of the school. Where the other areas thrummed with barely contained magical energy, this section felt dead, not peaceful, but genuinely lifeless, as if something had drained all the vitality from the very stones. The headmaster's private collection, Marcus whispered, remembering what he'd been told during his first tour. They passed doors that stood slightly ajar, revealing glimpses of rooms filled with artifacts that seemed to bend light around themselves. In one chamber, Thomas saw shelves lined with bottles containing swirling mists that might have been captured souls. In another, display cases held books that wrote themselves in languages that predated human speech. But it was the room at the end of the corridor that stopped them both in their tracks. It was a study of sorts, with walls lined with portraits similar to those in the headmaster's office. But these weren't paintings of successful graduates. They were pictures of students at the moment of their transformation into standing stones. Each portrait captured the exact instant when flesh became mineral, when consciousness was transferred from body to monument. My God, Marcus breathed. Look at the dates. Thomas studied the small plaques beneath each portrait. The earliest was dated 1847, just a few years after the school's founding. The most recent was dated only 3 months ago. A boy Thomas recognized from the dining hall, someone who had simply disappeared one day without explanation. They're not just punishing students who try to leave, Thomas realized. They're harvesting them, using their life force to power something. In the center of the room stood a large desk covered with maps of the surrounding moorland. The locations of the standing stones were marked with precise coordinates, and lines had been drawn connecting them in complex geometric patterns. "It's a ritual circle," Marcus said, his voice hollow with understanding. "The entire school is built at the center of a massive magical working. Every stone placed on the moors adds to its power." Thomas rifled through the papers on the desk, finding charts that tracked the magical potential of various students, calculations about optimal transformation timing, and detailed schedules for something called the final harvest. One document in particular caught his attention, a letter written in the headmaster's elegant handwriting. "My dear colleagues," and a Blackwood boy has arrived as anticipated. His bloodline potential exceeds even our most optimistic projections. With proper cultivation, his transformation should provide sufficient energy to complete the great working that has been our goal for these many decades. However, I must report an unexpected complication. The boy has somehow modified the basement binding spells, freeing the collected consciousness of our previous graduates from their containment. While this represents a setback, it also suggests that his power is even greater than we initially calculated. Sinai recommend proceeding with the accelerated curriculum. If we can guide his development properly, his willing transformation will provide exponentially more energy than a forced conversion. The risk is considerable, but the potential rewards justify any danger. And the standing circle is nearly complete. Only 7 more positions remain to be filled before we can attempt the grand summoning. With the Blackwood boys' power anchoring the working, we should finally be able to breach the barriers between dimensions and welcome our true masters back to this realm. For yours in service, Headmaster Cornelius Ashford. Thomas's blood turned to ice as he read the letter. The school wasn't just a prison for gifted children. It was a preparation facility for some kind of interdimensional invasion. The headmaster and his colleagues were planning to use the accumulated life force of hundreds of students to summon entities from another reality. "Thomas," Marcus said urgently, "look at this." He was standing before a large map that showed the school's basement levels in detail. The chambers Thomas had visited were clearly marked, but there were dozens of other rooms he hadn't seen: laboratories, ritual chambers, and something labeled simply as the deepest place. But what caught Thomas's attention was a section of wall near the map that looked newer than the rest. The stones were a slightly different color, and the mortar between them was visibly fresher. "Help me with this," Thomas said, running his hands along the wall's surface. Together they found a section of stones that shifted slightly when pressed. Behind the false wall was a hidden chamber, smaller than the others but filled with artifacts that made Thomas's skin crawl. Ancient weapons carved from materials he couldn't identify, ritual implements stained with substances he didn't want to think about, and books bound in leather that definitely hadn't come from any earthly animal. But most disturbing of all was what they found carved into the chamber's back wall, a symbol that Thomas recognized with a shock of absolute terror. It was the same symbol he'd seen embroidered on his school uniform, the same mark that decorated the white stones of the path leading to the school's entrance. But this version was different, older, carved deep into the stone with obvious reverence. And beneath it, etched in letters that seemed to glow with their own light, was a single word in the ancient language. A word that Thomas somehow understood without ever having learned it. A return. "Marcus," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I think I know what this symbol means, and I think I know why I'm really here." But before he could explain, they heard footsteps in the corridor outside, the measured tread of someone approaching the east wing with purpose and authority. "The headmaster," Marcus breathed. They quickly replaced the false stones and slipped out of the hidden chamber, but there was nowhere to run. The corridor had only one exit, and the footsteps were coming from that direction. Thomas looked around desperately, then noticed something he'd missed earlier. a section of wall near the corridor's end that looked slightly different from the rest. The stones were arranged in a pattern that seemed almost like writing, and one particular stone bore a mark that made his birthmark itch. Acting on pure instinct, Thomas pressed his palm against the marked stone and spoke a single word in the ancient language, not one he'd learned, but one that seemed to come from his bloodline itself. The wall shimmered and became transparent, revealing a narrow passage that led back toward the main building. They slipped through just as the headmaster's voice echoed from the study they'd just vacated. "Interesting," he said, though whether he was talking to himself or to someone else, Thomas couldn't tell. "It seems we have visitors." They ran through the hidden passage, which twisted and turned in ways that defied the building's visible architecture. Thomas realized they were traveling through the spaces between rooms, the gaps in reality that allowed Ealdor Hollow to be larger inside than outside. The passage finally opened into a familiar location, the basement chamber where Thomas had first encountered the ancient spirits, but now the space felt different. The malevolent presence was gone, replaced by something that felt almost welcoming. "And you have seen the truth," a voice said. Not the collective whisper he'd heard before, but a single clear consciousness that spoke directly to his mind. "Now you understand what you must do." "I understand that I'm in way over my head," Thomas replied aloud. "The headmaster isn't just collecting students. He's planning to use their life force to summon something from another dimension." "And a true masters," the voice confirmed. "But an entities that ruled this world before humanity learned to speak, before consciousness itself developed beyond the purely predatory. The headmaster believes he can control them, can use their power to reshape reality according to his desires." "Can he?" No. The true masters serve no one. If the barriers between dimensions are breached, they will consume everything: the headmaster, the school, the students, and eventually the entire world. They are hunger given form, emptiness that devours meaning itself. Marcus, who had been listening to Thomas's half of the conversation with growing alarm, spoke up. "Ask it how we can stop this." Thomas relayed the question, and the ancient consciousness paused before answering. "A ritual requires willing sacrifice from someone of the Thorn bloodline. Without your consent, the headmaster cannot complete his working, but he will not give up easily. He will use every tool at his disposal to convince you to cooperate." "What about the other students? Can they be saved?" "Those who have not yet begun the final transformation can be freed, but it will require dismantling the school's power structure entirely, breaking the binding spells that hold us, destroying the ritual, circles carved into the basement levels, and most importantly, severing the connection between this place and the true master's realm." "How do we do that?" "Symbol you found in the hidden chamber. It is a key, carved into the stone by your ancestor, the one who built this school before it was corrupted. It can be used to unravel everything that has been built here, but only by someone of the bloodline." Thomas felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. He was the key to stopping an interdimensional invasion, but using that key would likely cost him his life. "Then there is another way," the voice continued, as if reading his thoughts. "The symbol can be activated gradually, piece by piece. Each activation will weaken the school's power and free more of the trapped students. But it will also alert the headmaster to what you are doing." "A running battle," Marcus said grimly. "Free the students a few at a time while staying ahead of the headmaster's countermeasures." "Precisely. But you will not be alone. We who remain bound in the stone can aid you, as can any student whose mind has been cleared of the school's influence." Thomas looked around the chamber, seeing it now not as a prison but as a fortress, a place where the school's original purpose still lived, waiting for someone with the power to restore it. "What was this place supposed to be?" he asked. "Before it was corrupted? A sanctuary, a school where those with magical gifts could learn to use their abilities for the betterment of all humanity. Your ancestor built it as a place of learning and growth, not consumption and control." "Then that's what will make it again," Thomas said with growing conviction. "We'll free the students, stop the summoning, and restore the school to what it was meant to be. The path will be dangerous. The headmaster has had centuries to perfect his methods. He will not hesitate to sacrifice any student who threatens his plans. Then we'll have to be smarter than he is, Thomas replied, and we'll have to be fast. As if summoned by his words, they heard the sound of footsteps echoing from multiple directions, not just the measured tread of the headmaster, but the shuffling gait of something that might once have been human. So, the ancient voice urged, return to your rooms. Pretend to consider the headmaster's offer while you plan your next move. But be careful, he will be watching you more closely now. Thomas and Marcus hurried back through the hidden passages, emerging in the main building just as the bells chimed 10 o'clock. They separated at the dormitory corridor, each returning to his own room as if nothing had happened. But as Thomas closed his door behind him, he found a piece of parchment that hadn't been there before lying on his pillow. In the headmaster's elegant handwriting it read, Mr. Blackwood, Son, I trust you found your evening exploration educational. We really must discuss your tendency toward unauthorized investigation. My office, tomorrow at dawn. To try to get some rest. Tomorrow's lessons will be quite intensive. For yours in service, Headmaster Ashford. Thomas crumpled the note and threw it in the corner. The battle for Ealdor Hollow had begun, and he was nowhere near ready for what was coming. But as he lay down to sleep, he felt something he hadn't experienced since arriving at the school. Hope. The ancient spirits were on his side. Marcus was regaining his true memories, and somewhere in the hidden chambers of the East Wing was a symbol that could unravel centuries of corruption. He just had to stay alive long enough to use it. Outside his window, the standing stones on the moors pulsed with faint light, and in the distance, something that might have been thunder rumbled across the sky, though there were no clouds to be seen. The true masters were stirring, sensing that their long-awaited return might finally be at hand. Thomas closed his eyes and began to plan. Chapter 8, The Final Gambit. Thomas woke before dawn to find his room filled with symbols he'd never seen before, not carved into the walls or written on parchment, but hanging in the air itself like mathematical equations made of light. They pulsed gently, and as he watched, he realized they were spelling out a message in the ancient language. The time grows short. The headmaster moves to accelerate his plans. You must act today or all will be lost. He dressed quickly and made his way to the headmaster's office, his mind racing with the fragments of a plan that seemed impossibly desperate. But as he climbed the stairs to the administrative levels, he noticed that the building itself was changing. Doors appeared where none had been before. Corridors branched in new directions, and the very walls seemed to pulse with anticipation. The headmaster was waiting for him in an office that had transformed overnight into something resembling a laboratory. Arcane instruments hummed with power, charts covered every available surface, and in the center of it all stood a device that looked like a cross between an altar and a telescope, its crystal components focusing on some distant point beyond the physical world. Ah, Thomas, the headmaster said without turning around. Right on time. I trust you slept well? Well enough, Thomas replied, keeping his voice neutral. Excellent. Because today we begin your real education. The headmaster finally turned to face him, and Thomas saw that the man's kind eyes now held flecks of something that wasn't entirely human. Tell me, what did you think of your exploration of the East Wing? Thomas felt his heart skip a beat, but he kept his expression steady. I don't know what you mean. Of course you do. The hidden chamber, the symbol carved into the wall, the documents detailing our long-term plans. The headmaster smiled. Did you really think you could enter my personal sanctum without my knowledge? Every stone in this building is connected to my consciousness, Thomas. I felt your presence the moment you touched the false wall. Then why didn't you stop us? Because I wanted you to understand the scope of what we're attempting here, the sheer magnitude of the working we're preparing to undertake. The headmaster gestured to the device in the center of the room. This is a dimensional breach generator, powered by the accumulated life force of everyone who has ever studied at Ealdor Hollow. When activated, it will tear a hole in reality itself, allowing the true masters to return to this world. Thomas stared at the machine, trying to memorize its configuration. If he could damage it somehow. You're thinking of sabotage, the headmaster observed, but you should know that this device is merely the focal point. The real power source is the ritual circle formed by the standing stones on the moors. Destroy this machine and I'll simply build another. The stones are the key to everything. Then why show me this at all? Because I want you to understand that resistance is futile. The working will be completed, Thomas. The only question is whether you'll participate willingly or be forced to contribute your power posthumously. The headmaster's smile faded. I had hoped to offer you a partnership, to share power with someone of your remarkable abilities. But if you insist on playing the role of the rebellious student, I'll simply add your life force to the collection and proceed without your cooperation. Thomas thought of the symbol in the hidden chamber, of the ancient spirits waiting in the basement levels, of Marcus and the other students who might still be saved. Then he thought of something else, something the headmaster had said that didn't quite make sense. You said the stones are the key, Thomas said slowly. But stones can be destroyed. Can they? Perhaps you should ask your parents about that. They tried to destroy several of the monuments during their escape attempt. The results were educational. The headmaster walked to a window that looked out over the moors. In the early morning light, Thomas could see that the standing stones were arranged in a perfect spiral pattern, with the school at its center. But now he noticed something else. Some of the stones were different from the others, darker, more weathered, and positioned at key points in the geometric pattern. Those are the original markers, the headmaster explained, following his gaze. Placed by your ancestor when he first built this sanctuary. They were meant to protect the school from outside influence, but with a few modifications, they serve our purposes quite well. Thomas felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. The original protective circle had been corrupted, turned into a summoning array. But if the corruption could be reversed... You're wondering if the original protections can be restored, the headmaster said. The answer is yes, theoretically. But it would require someone of the bloodline to physically visit each stone and speak the proper reversal incantations, a process that would take days, during which that person would be completely vulnerable to attack. Attack from what? From the guardians I've placed at each stone, the spirits of students who attempted similar acts of sabotage over the years. They're quite protective of their monuments now. Thomas suppressed a shudder. The headmaster hadn't just been turning failed escape attempts into standing stones. He'd been turning them into undead guardians for his ritual circle. However, the headmaster continued, there is a much simpler solution to your concerns about the true masters. Join me willingly, and I'll ensure that when they arrive, you're granted a position of authority in the new order. Refuse, and you'll simply be consumed along with everyone else. Some choice. It's more choice than most people get. The working will be completed within the week, Thomas. The dimensional barriers are already weakening. Surely you've noticed the changes in the building's architecture, the way reality has become more flexible around us. Thomas had noticed. Doors that led to impossible places, corridors that rearranged themselves when no one was looking, rooms that existed in spaces larger than the building could contain. The boundary between dimensions was already beginning to blur. What do you need me to do? He asked, hoping he sounded defeated rather than calculating. Simply place your hand on the focusing crystal and speak the activation phrase I'll teach you. Your bloodline will provide the final key to opening the dimensional breach. The headmaster gestured to the device in the center of the room. One word, Thomas. One word to reshape the world. And if I refuse, then I'll drain your life force slowly over the course of several days, while you watch me do the same to your fellow students. Starting with Mr. Whitmore, I think. He's recovered too much of his original personality to be useful anyway. Thomas felt anger flare in his chest, not just at the threat to Marcus, but at the casual way the headmaster discussed destroying young lives. This man had been feeding on students for centuries, consuming their potential and their futures to fuel his megalomaniacal ambitions. I need time to think about it, Thomas said. Of course, but not too much time. The celestial alignment we require will reach its peak in 3 days. After that, we'll have to wait another century for conditions to be optimal again. The headmaster's smile returned. I'm not a patient man, Thomas. I have been waiting far too long already. Thomas left the office with his mind spinning. 3 days. He had 3 days to free the students, reverse the corruption of the protective circle, and prevent an interdimensional invasion. It was impossible. But as he walked through the corridors of Ealdor Hollow, he began to notice things he'd missed before. Students moving with more purpose than he'd seen since arriving, shadows that fell in the wrong directions, whispers in the walls that carried notes of rebellion rather than seduction. The ancient spirits weren't just waiting passively, they were actively working to undermine the headmaster's control, and if Thomas was reading the signs correctly, he wasn't the only student who had begun to remember what was being done to them. He found Marcus in the library, ostensibly studying, but actually examining a map of the surrounding moorland. Several other students sat nearby, boys Thomas recognized from meals, but who now looked at him with eyes that held awareness rather than the blank compliance he'd grown accustomed to. "Thomas," Marcus said quietly, "we need to talk. All of us." Thomas looked around the library and realized that perhaps a dozen students had gathered there, not obviously together, but positioned so they could hear each other speak. All of them showed signs of recovery from the school's influence, clearer eyes, more defined shadows, movements that suggested independent thought rather than programmed behavior. "How many?" Thomas asked, settling into a chair beside Marcus. 17 so far," replied Sebastian Ashford, the boy Thomas had met on his first night. "Your little adventure in the basement levels has been having cascading effects. The binding spells that kept us docile are unraveling. The headmaster knows," Thomas warned. "He's planning to accelerate the timeline. 3 days." A murmur of concern rippled through the gathered students. 3 days isn't enough time to free everyone," said one of the older boys, a student named David who looked to be in his early 20s. "There are still 43 students in various stages of transformation. Some of them are too far gone to save." "Then we save who we can," Thomas replied. "The headmaster showed me the dimensional breach device. It's in his office, but the real power source is the stone circle on the moors." "The stones are guarded," Marcus pointed out, "not just by whatever the headmaster has placed there, but by the geography itself. The moors shift when you try to approach the outer markers. Students have gotten lost for days trying to reach them." Thomas thought about the symbol in the hidden chamber, about the way it had made his birthmark itch when he looked at it. What if we don't try to reach them from the outside? What if we approach them from below? Sebastian raised an eyebrow. "Below? The basement levels extend far beyond what we've seen, and the ancient spirits said this place was built as a sanctuary originally. There might be tunnels, passages that lead to the stones from underground." "Even if there are," David said, "how do we reverse whatever the headmaster has done to corrupt them?" Thomas pulled out a piece of paper and began sketching the symbol he'd seen in the east wing. As he drew, several of the other students leaned forward with expressions of recognition. "I've dreamed about that mark," one of them whispered. "It's carved under my bed," said another. "I see it every time I close my eyes," Sebastian added. Thomas felt a chill of understanding. "It's not just carved in the hidden chamber. It's everywhere, isn't it? Hidden throughout the school, waiting for someone who could activate it." Marcus nodded slowly. "Your ancestor didn't just build protective circles around the school. He built the symbol into the school itself. Every stone, every corridor, every room is part of a massive protective working. But it's been corrupted," Thomas said, "turned inside out to serve the headmaster's purposes instead of its original function." "So how do we uncorrupt it?" David asked. Thomas looked around at the faces of his fellow students, young men who had been brought here against their will, slowly drained of their humanity to serve someone else's ambitions. But now they were fighting back, reclaiming their identities and their power. "We don't try to destroy what the headmaster has built," he said with growing conviction. "We restore what was there before. We speak the original words in the original places, and we remind the school what it was meant to be. A sanctuary," Marcus said, understanding dawning in his eyes. "A place of learning and growth," Sebastian added. "A school where gifted children could be safe," David concluded. Thomas stood up, feeling power flow through him. Not the seductive corruption he'd sensed in the basement chamber, but something clean and purposeful that came from his bloodline itself. "Then that's what we're going to make it," he declared. "All of us together. We're going to take back Ealdor Hollow." Outside the library windows, storm clouds were gathering over the moors, and in the distance, the standing stones began to pulse with an ominous light. The true masters had sensed the stirring of resistance, and they were not pleased. But Thomas no longer cared what ancient entities from other dimensions thought about his plans. He had work to do, friends to save, and a school to restore. The final battle for Ealdor Hollow was about to begin. End of Part 1. An author's note. This concludes the opening section of the Cursed Academy, establishing the main conflict, characters, and the revelation of the Echo Clue, the symbol that represents both Thomas's heritage and the key to the school's salvation. The story has introduced the 7 forbidden rules, shown their consequences when broken, and revealed the true nature of both the threat and the solution. The Echo Clue, the symbol appearing in Thomas's own handwriting despite never having learned it, serves as the central mystery that ties together his bloodline heritage, the school's original purpose, and the method by which the corruption can be reversed. The symbol represents return, not just Thomas's return to his ancestral home, but the school's potential return to its original function as a sanctuary rather than a trap.